George Strait and his wife transformed the life of a desperate fan and moved a nation. The morning sun cast long shadows across the charred remains of what had once been Emily Parker's sanctuary. 3 weeks had passed since the fire, but the acrid smell of smoke still clung to the air like a stubborn ghost refusing to leave. Emily stood at the edge of what used to be her front yard, clutching a faded photograph of her father in his army uniform, his weathered hands holding a George Strait album like it was made of pure gold. At 34, Emily had built her life around two passions: teaching music to children and preserving the memory of Sergeant James Parker, the man who had raised her single-handedly after her mother's departure when she was just 7 years old. Her father had been more than a parent. He had been her anchor, her compass, and most importantly, her introduction to the healing power of country music. Every evening after his long shifts at the local auto repair shop, James would put on a George Strait record, and they would dance in their tiny living room, her small feet balanced on his worn work boots. The fire had taken everything. Not just the modest two-bedroom house where she had lived for the past decade, but something far more precious: her father's complete collection of George Strait albums, accumulated over 30 years of devoted fandom. Each record told a story, marked with dates and occasions written in her father's careful handwriting. Emily's first steps. Pure country playing, read one. The day she graduated college. Carrying your love with me, noted another. Those albums weren't just music. They were the soundtrack to their life together, the tangible proof that love could survive even the darkest moments. Now, standing in the aftermath of devastation, Emily felt more alone than she had since her father's death from lung cancer 2 years earlier. The insurance money would barely cover basic necessities, let alone replace the irreplaceable. Her teaching salary at Riverside Elementary was modest, and the small rural community where she worked was struggling with its own financial challenges. The school district had been understanding about her situation, but she could see the concern in Principal Morrison's eyes every time he looked at her. How long could she maintain her composure in front of her students when her own world had crumbled? It was during one of those sleepless nights, as she sat in the cramped motel room that had become her temporary home, that Emily made a decision that would change everything. She had been scrolling through old photos on her phone, trying to salvage digital memories, when she came across a picture from her father's last birthday. There he was, grinning from ear to ear, holding his prized possession, a signed copy of George Strait's greatest hits album. In that moment, something inside Emily shifted. She couldn't bring her father back, and she couldn't undo the fire, but she could honor his memory in a way that felt meaningful. The idea seemed crazy even to her logical mind. Who goes to a celebrity's private residence uninvited? But Emily wasn't thinking with pure logic anymore. She was thinking with a heart that desperately needed to express gratitude for the man who had shaped her entire understanding of love, loss, and resilience. If you're watching this story unfold and feeling moved by Emily's journey, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us about a time when music helped you through a difficult period, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Whether you're joining us from Texas, California, or anywhere else in this beautiful country, your support means the world to us. Emily spent her last $43 on a bouquet of Texas wildflowers, the same kind her father used to pick for her during their weekend drives through the hill country. She carefully composed a handwritten note on simple stationery, her cursive flowing with the same precision her father had taught her when she was learning to write. "Dear Mr. Strait," she began, "you don't know me, but your music was the thread that wove my father and me together for 30 years. He passed away 2 years ago, and last month I lost everything in a house fire, including his collection of your albums. I'm not asking for anything except to say thank you for giving us something beautiful to share. These flowers are from Texas soil, just like the songs that saved us both." The drive to San Antonio felt like a pilgrimage. Emily had never been to George Strait's neighborhood, but she had looked up the address online, driven by a compulsion she couldn't fully explain to herself. The opulent community was a stark contrast to her rural hometown, with manicured lawns and imposing gates that spoke of a world far removed from her own reality. As she navigated the winding streets in her decade-old Honda Civic, Emily began to question her decision. What was she really hoping to accomplish? George Strait was one of the most private celebrities in country music, known for avoiding public interactions and maintaining strict boundaries between his professional and personal life. When she finally reached the impressive iron gates of the Strait mansion, Emily's hands began to tremble. The property was magnificent, with sprawling grounds visible through the ornate metalwork and a security system that looked more sophisticated than anything she had ever encountered. For a moment she considered turning around and driving back to her motel room. This was foolish, she told herself. George Strait was probably not even home, and even if he was, why would he care about the problems of a small-town teacher he had never met? But then she thought of her father, of the way his eyes would light up every time Amarillo Morning came on the radio, of how he would turn up the volume and sing along with tears in his eyes during The Chair. James Parker had worked double shifts to buy those albums, sacrificing his own comforts to build a collection that connected him to something larger than his everyday struggles. Those records had been his escape, his joy, and his gift to his daughter. Emily owed it to his memory to complete this gesture, no matter how insignificant it might seem. She parked her car along the street and walked slowly toward the gate, the wildflowers clutched in her sweating palms. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, with only the distant sound of lawn sprinklers and the occasional bark of a well-trained dog. Emily approached the gate with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space, acutely aware that she was crossing into a world where she didn't belong. She knelt down on the pristine sidewalk and carefully placed the bouquet against the base of the gate, securing her handwritten note with a small piece of tape she had brought for the purpose. The moment felt both anticlimactic and profound. Emily had driven 3 hours and spent her last money on this simple gesture, and now it was done. She stood up, brushed the dust from her knees, and took one last look at the mansion beyond the gates. Somewhere inside that beautiful home lived the man whose voice had provided the soundtrack to her happiest memories, the artist who had unknowingly helped her father and daughter build an unbreakable bond through the power of song. As Emily turned to walk back to her car, she felt a strange mixture of sadness and peace. She had done what she came to do, had honored her father's memory in the only way that felt authentic to her broken heart. The flowers would probably be removed by groundskeeping staff within hours, and her note would likely never reach George Strait himself, but that wasn't really the point anymore. The point was that she had refused to let tragedy silence the gratitude in her heart. What Emily didn't know, as she slowly made her way back down the elegant street, was that every step of her visit had been captured by high-definition security cameras. Inside the mansion, George Strait and his wife Norma were watching the monitors with growing curiosity, studying the young woman who had approached their private sanctuary with such obvious vulnerability and respect. In all their years of fame, they had never witnessed anything quite like this gentle intrusion, and something about Emily's demeanor had captured their attention in a way that would soon change all of their lives forever. George leaned forward in his leather chair, adjusting his reading glasses as he studied the monitor more closely. At 73, the King of Country had seen every type of fan behavior imaginable, from the overly enthusiastic to the downright frightening. But this woman was different. There was no desperate attempt to scale the gate, no shouting or dramatic gestures. She had simply knelt down, placed her flowers with the care of someone tending a grave, and walked away. "Norma, come look at this," George called to his wife, who was in the kitchen preparing their usual Sunday afternoon tea. After 52 years of marriage, Norma Strait had developed an almost supernatural ability to read her husband's moods, and something in his voice told her this wasn't a routine security matter. Norma wiped her hands on a dish towel and joined George in his study, her silver hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows. She had always been the more intuitive of the pair, able to sense genuine emotion from a mile away. As she watched the playback of Emily's visit, her experienced eyes caught details that others might miss. The way the young woman's shoulders shook slightly as she knelt, the careful manner in which she arranged the flowers, the reverent pause before she stood to leave. "She's hurting," Norma said simply, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had experienced her own share of profound loss. The Straits had buried their daughter Jennifer in 1986, a tragedy that had tested their faith and their marriage in ways they rarely discussed publicly. That kind of pain leaves permanent scars, but it also creates an ability to recognize suffering in others. George reached for the note that their security team had already retrieved from the gate. The handwriting was precise and careful, the kind that spoke of someone who took time with words, who understood their power. As he read Emily's message aloud, both he and Norma fell silent. The gratitude expressed in those simple sentences carried a weight that touched something deep in their hearts. "She lost everything," Norma whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. "And she came here not to ask for something, but to say thank you." In their decades of fame, they had received thousands of letters from fans, but most carried requests or demands. This note was different. It was pure gratitude, offered freely despite the writer's obvious pain. George stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the front gate. He could still see Emily's car in the distance, moving slowly down the street, as if she were reluctant to leave completely. Something about her story resonated with memories of his own father, who had worked construction jobs to support George's early musical dreams. He thought of the sacrifices parents make for their children, of the way music can become a bridge between generations, and of how quickly life can take away the things we treasure most. "What if we invited her in?" George asked suddenly, the words surprising even himself. In all their years of marriage, Norma had never known her husband to make such a spontaneous suggestion regarding a fan. Their privacy was sacred, carefully guarded by both professional necessity and personal preference. Norma studied her husband's profile as he continued to watch the street. She had learned to trust his instincts over the decades, had watched him make decisions based on gut feelings that almost always proved correct. But this was different from anything they had done before. "George, we don't know anything about her except what's in that note," Norma said gently, though her tone suggested she was already considering the possibility. "She could be anyone." "Look at her again," George replied, pointing to the monitor that still showed the recorded footage. "Watch how she moves, how she respects our space. That's not someone who's going to cause problems. That's someone in pain who needed to do something meaningful." They watched the footage again in silence, both of them studying Emily's body language and demeanor. There was something achingly familiar about her grief, something that reminded them of their own darkest days. When they had lost Jennifer, music had been one of the few things that helped them process their emotions. George's songs had become a way to channel pain into something beautiful, and perhaps this young woman understood that connection better than most. Her father was a veteran, Norma observed, having caught that detail in the note. He raised her alone after her mother left. Think about what that means, George. This man worked hard jobs and spent his money on your albums because they meant something to him, and now his daughter has lost even that connection to him. George felt a tightening in his chest as he considered the full weight of Emily's situation. He had always taken his success seriously, understanding that his music became part of people's most important moments. Wedding dances, family road trips, quiet evenings at home. His songs provided the soundtrack for millions of American lives. But rarely did he get such a direct glimpse into how deeply that music could matter to someone. The decision seemed to make itself. George walked to the phone and dialed his security team, requesting that they intercept the young woman before she left the neighborhood. His hands were steady, but his heart was racing with an emotion he couldn't quite name. This wasn't about charity or public relations. This was about recognizing a kindred spirit and responding to genuine need with genuine compassion. "Sir, are you sure about this?" asked Marcus, the head of security who had worked for the Straits for over a decade. "We've never made contact with a fan who came to the residence uninvited." "I'm sure," George replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him a leader in the country music industry for nearly 50 years. "Tell her that Mr. and Mrs. Strait would like to speak with her if she's comfortable with that. Be gentle about it, Marcus. She's been through enough." Norma placed her hand on her husband's arm, a gesture of support that spoke of their deep partnership. They had built their life together on principles of kindness and integrity, always trying to use their success to make positive differences in the world. But this felt more personal than their usual charitable activities. This felt like an opportunity to directly touch one life in a meaningful way. "What are we going to say to her?" Norma asked, though her question carried no doubt about their decision. She was already mentally preparing tea and trying to imagine how they could make a grieving stranger feel comfortable in their home. "We're going to listen to her," George answered simply. "We're going to let her know that her gratitude means something to us, that her father's love for music matters. And then we'll see what happens from there." As they waited for Marcus to return with Emily, both George and Norma felt a nervous excitement they hadn't experienced in years. Their quiet Sunday afternoon was about to become something entirely unexpected, and neither of them could predict where this spontaneous act of openness might lead. What they did know was that sometimes the most important moments in life come disguised as ordinary encounters, and that genuine human connection transcends the boundaries of fame and social status. Outside, Emily had just reached her car when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see a professionally dressed man approaching with a kind smile, and her heart began to race with a mixture of fear and confusion. Had she somehow violated a law by leaving flowers at the gate? Was she about to be arrested for trespassing on private property? "Excuse me, miss," Marcus said gently, his voice carrying none of the authority she had expected. "I'm with the Strait family's security team. Mr. and Mrs. Strait saw you at the gate and were wondering if you might have a few minutes to speak with them. They'd like to thank you for the flowers and the note." Emily stared at him in complete disbelief, certain she had misunderstood his words. George Strait wanted to speak with her. This had to be some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. People like her didn't get invited into the homes of country music royalty. This kind of thing only happened in movies or dreams. "I'm sorry, I think there's been some confusion," Emily stammered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I'm nobody special. I just wanted to leave the flowers. I wasn't trying to bother anyone or cause any problems." Marcus smiled at her obvious sincerity, understanding why his employers had been moved by this young woman's genuine nature. "No confusion, miss. Mr. and Mrs. Strait specifically requested that I ask if you'd be willing to visit with them for a few minutes. Of course, you're under no obligation, but they seemed quite touched by your gesture." Emily's hands began to shake as the reality of the situation slowly penetrated her shock. This was actually happening. George Strait, the man whose voice had provided comfort during her father's illness and whose songs had played at James Parker's funeral, wanted to meet her. The absurdity and wonder of it all threatened to overwhelm her completely, and she found herself struggling to form coherent words in response to this impossible invitation. I don't understand," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle afternoon breeze that rustled through the perfectly manicured oak trees lining the street. "Are you sure they meant me? I'm just a school teacher from a small town. I don't even have proper clothes for meeting someone like Mr. Strait." Marcus had worked in personal security for over 20 years, protecting celebrities, politicians, and business leaders, but he had rarely encountered someone so genuinely humble in the face of unexpected opportunity. Most people who sought access to the Strait property came with agendas, expectations, or demands. This young woman seemed almost afraid of accepting a gift she had never asked for. "Ma'am, I can assure you that Mr. and Mrs. Strait don't care about what you're wearing," Marcus said with a warmth that went beyond his professional obligations. "They were moved by your story and would simply like to meet the person who took the time to honor her father's memory in such a thoughtful way. But please, only if you feel comfortable. There's no pressure here." Emily looked down at her faded jeans and simple cotton blouse, clothes she had chosen for comfort during what she expected to be a solitary pilgrimage. She thought of her father, of how he would have reacted to this impossible turn of events. James Parker had always taught her that when life offers unexpected gifts, you accept them with grace and gratitude. "Don't look a gift horse in the mouth, sweetheart," he used to say. "Sometimes the universe has plans we can't see." "Okay," Emily said, the word emerging as barely more than a breath. "Okay, yes, I would be honored to meet them." The walk back toward the gate felt surreal, as if Emily were moving through a dream where the laws of probability had been temporarily suspended. Marcus led her to a smaller pedestrian entrance she hadn't noticed before, where sophisticated biometric scanners verified his identity with quiet efficiency. As they passed through multiple security checkpoints, Emily began to grasp the level of privacy protection that surrounded the Strait family's daily life. The mansion's interior exceeded every expectation Emily might have harbored. The foyer featured soaring ceilings with hand-carved wooden beams, and the walls displayed an impressive collection of platinum albums, Grammy Awards, and photographs documenting decades of country music history. But despite the grandeur, there was an unmistakable warmth to the space, a sense that this was truly a family home rather than a showpiece. Emily, the voice that spoke her name, was unmistakably familiar, though hearing it in person rather than through speakers created an almost otherworldly experience. George Strait emerged from a side room, dressed casually in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, looking remarkably like any other Texas gentleman spending a quiet Sunday at home. The only hints of his superstar status were the natural confidence in his bearing and the genuine warmth in his eyes. Behind him appeared Norma Strait, a woman whose elegant presence immediately put Emily at ease. There was something maternal about Norma's smile, something that suggested she understood the overwhelming nature of this encounter and was prepared to guide Emily through it with patience and kindness. "Mr. Strait, Mrs. Strait," Emily managed, her voice trembling with emotion. "I can't believe this is really happening. I'm so sorry if I disturbed your privacy. I never expected... I just wanted to leave the flowers and say thank you." "You have nothing to apologize for," Norma said, stepping forward to take Emily's hands in her own. "Your note was beautiful, and we were both deeply touched by your gesture. Would you like to sit down? I've just made some fresh tea, and we'd love to hear more about your father." They settled in a comfortable living room that managed to feel both luxurious and homey, with family photographs mixed among the music industry memorabilia. Emily found herself seated across from two of country music's most private figures, people who rarely granted interviews and almost never opened their personal space to strangers. The magnitude of their gesture was not lost on her. "Tell us about James," George said gently, using her father's name as if he had known the man personally. "Your note mentioned he was a veteran and a long-time fan. What made music so important to your relationship with him?" As Emily began to speak about her father, something magical happened. The nervousness that had gripped her since Marcus first approached her car began to fade, replaced by the comfortable feeling of sharing beloved memories with understanding listeners. She told them about James Parker's service in Vietnam, about how he had returned home to find his wife gone and his 7-year-old daughter in the care of neighbors who couldn't keep her much longer. "He was 26 years old and suddenly raising a child alone," Emily said, her voice growing stronger as she warmed to the story. "He worked 2 jobs most of my childhood, but every evening when he came home, no matter how tired he was, he would put on music, usually yours, Mr. Strait. He said your songs reminded him that hard work and integrity still mattered in the world." George felt a tightening in his throat as he listened to Emily's story. Throughout his career, he had always hoped his music would resonate with working people, with families struggling to build good lives through honest effort. But hearing such a specific example of how his songs had provided comfort and strength to a single father, raising his daughter alone, touched him in ways he hadn't expected. "What was his favorite song?" Norma asked, genuinely curious about the musical preferences of this man they were getting to know through his daughter's loving descriptions. "The Chair," Emily answered immediately, a soft smile crossing her face at the memory. "He must have played that song 1,000 times over the years. He said it reminded him that love could surprise you when you least expected it, that sometimes the most important conversations happen in the most ordinary places. When I was little, he used to dance with me to that song in our kitchen, singing along in his gravelly voice." George and Norma exchanged a meaningful glance. "The Chair" had always been one of George's personal favorites, a song about chance encounters and unexpected connections. The irony of Emily mentioning that particular song, given the circumstances of their current meeting, was not lost on either of them. "Emily," George said carefully, "I have to ask about the fire. Losing your home and your father's collection must have been devastating. How are you coping with all of that?" The question opened a floodgate of emotion that Emily had been holding back for weeks. She told them about the night of the fire, about watching everything she owned disappear in flames, about the insurance adjuster who treated her father's albums as worthless collectibles rather than priceless family heirlooms. She spoke about the loneliness of staying in a motel room, about the well-meaning but ultimately hollow condolences of people who couldn't understand what she had really lost. "The hardest part isn't the house or the furniture," Emily said, tears flowing freely now. "Those things can be replaced. It's that I lost the last physical connection to my father. Those albums weren't just music to us. They were our shared history. Every scratch on every record told a story about when we played it and why it mattered. Now all of that is gone, and I feel like I've lost him all over again." Norma rose from her chair and moved to sit beside Emily on the sofa, putting a comforting arm around the younger woman's shoulders. The gesture was natural and maternal, born from years of nurturing her own children and grandchildren through various crises. There was no awkwardness in the contact, only genuine human compassion. "You haven't lost him," Norma said firmly. "The love between you and your father, the lessons he taught you, the memories you shared, those things can't be destroyed by fire. They live in here." She placed her hand gently over Emily's heart. "And they always will." George watched this interaction with growing admiration for both women. His wife's instinctive kindness toward a stranger in pain reminded him why he had fallen in love with her over 5 decades ago, and Emily's grace in the face of overwhelming loss spoke volumes about the kind of man who had raised her. "Emily," George said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he was about to say something important, "I want to show you something. Would you mind coming with me to another room?" Emily looked up through her tears, nodding despite her confusion about where this conversation might be heading. George and Norma led her through the mansion's hallways, past rooms filled with comfortable furniture and family photographs that humanized these larger-than-life figures. They stopped at a heavy wooden door that George opened with obvious reverence. The room beyond took Emily's breath away. It was George Strait's personal music room, featuring professional recording equipment, multiple guitars mounted on the walls, and floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with vinyl records, CDs, and musical memorabilia spanning his entire career. But what captured Emily's attention immediately was a particular section of shelving that contained what appeared to be multiple copies of every album George had ever released, arranged in chronological order with meticulous care. "This is my personal archive," George explained, gesturing toward the impressive collection. "I keep multiple copies of everything, partly for preservation and partly because music has always been my way of marking important moments in my life. Every album here represents not just songs, but memories of the people who helped create them and the fans who made them meaningful." Emily stared at the collection in wonder, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was seeing. This wasn't just a display of commercial success, it was a lifetime's worth of musical achievement, preserved with the care of someone who understood the emotional weight that physical recordings could carry. "Why are you showing me this?" Emily asked, though part of her was beginning to suspect that this visit was leading toward something far beyond a simple meet and greet with sympathetic celebrities. George and Norma exchanged another meaningful look, the kind of wordless communication that develops between couples who have shared decades of decision-making together. What they were contemplating was unprecedented in their experience, but both of them felt certain it was the right thing to do. "Because, Emily," George said with a smile that suggested he was about to deliver news that would change everything, "I think your father's collection deserves to be rebuilt, and I think I know exactly how to make that happen." Emily stared at him in confusion, her mind struggling to process what he might mean. Rebuilding her father's collection would cost thousands of dollars, money she simply didn't have and wouldn't have for years to come. Surely George Strait wasn't suggesting what her heart desperately hoped he was suggesting. "I don't understand," Emily whispered, afraid to hope for something that seemed too good to be true. George walked to a specific section of his archive and began pulling albums from the shelves with careful deliberation. Each one he selected bore his signature in permanent marker, and as Emily watched in growing amazement, she realized these weren't just any copies of his albums. These were the personal copies from his own collection, records that had likely been with him since the beginning of his career. "These belong to me personally," George said, his voice gentle but filled with purpose. "Every one of these albums has been part of my life, part of my journey in music. Some of them are first pressings, some are rarities that most collectors never get to see. I want you to have them, Emily. I want your father's collection to live again through these." Emily's legs suddenly felt weak, and she reached out to steady herself against the wall. This couldn't be happening. People didn't give away priceless collections to strangers, especially not collections that represented decades of personal and professional history. "Mr. Strait, I can't accept something like this," Emily protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "These records must be worth a fortune, and they're part of your personal history. I'm nobody special. I'm just a teacher who lost everything in a fire." Norma stepped forward, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of watching her husband do what she knew was right. "Emily, you're not nobody special. You're a daughter who loved her father enough to drive 3 hours to thank a stranger for the music that brought them together. You're a teacher who shapes young minds every day. You're a woman who has faced tremendous loss and still found gratitude in her heart. If that's not special, I don't know what is." George continued selecting albums, his movements deliberate and purposeful. With each record he added to the growing pile, Emily felt her emotional defenses crumbling further. This was beyond generosity. This was an act of compassion that defied her understanding of how the world typically worked. "There's more," George said, and Emily wondered how there could possibly be more than what he had already offered. I've been thinking about what you said regarding your father's military service and his love for music. There's something else I'd like to do for you, but first I need to ask you a question. Are you planning to stay in teaching? Yes, Emily answered without hesitation. It's what I love doing, even though the pay isn't much. My father always said that teachers shape the future one child at a time. I can't imagine doing anything else. George nodded approvingly. I thought you might say that. Emily, in addition to these albums, Norma and I would like to help you rebuild your life in a more substantial way. We want to help you buy a new house, and we want to make sure it includes something special. A proper music room where you can honor your father's memory and maybe inspire some of your students to love music the way he did. The room began to spin around Emily as the full magnitude of what George was offering hit her. A house, a music room, albums worth thousands of dollars. This level of generosity was beyond anything she had ever imagined possible, and she found herself struggling to breathe as the reality of it all washed over her. I don't know what to say, Emily managed through her tears. This is too much. You don't even know me. Why would you do something like this for a complete stranger? It was Norma who answered, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had lived through her own share of tragedy and triumph. Because sometimes life puts people in our path for a reason, Emily. When George and I lost our daughter Jennifer many years ago, we learned that grief can either make you bitter or it can make you more compassionate. We chose compassion. Your story, your loss, your gratitude, it all reminds us that music has the power to heal, to connect, to give meaning to the hardest moments of our lives. George sat down across from Emily, his expression serious but kind. I've been blessed beyond measure in my career, Emily. I've had success I never dreamed of when I was starting out, and with that success comes responsibility. Not just to my fans, but to the values that my music represents. Hard work, family, integrity, helping your neighbors when they're down. Those aren't just lyrics to me. They're how I try to live my life. But this is so much more than helping a neighbor, Emily protested. This is changing my entire life. Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen, George replied. Maybe your father's love for music and your dedication to teaching, and the way you honored both of those things by coming here today, maybe all of that is supposed to lead to something bigger than any of us expected. Emily looked around the music room, at the walls lined with instruments and awards, at the careful preservation of a lifetime's worth of musical achievement. She thought about her father, about how he would have reacted to this moment. James Parker had always believed in the power of kindness, in the idea that good people sometimes receive unexpected blessings. But even his optimistic worldview couldn't have prepared him for something like this. There is one condition, George added, and Emily's heart skipped a beat, wondering what strings might be attached to this incredible offer. What kind of condition? She asked carefully. I want you to promise me that you'll use that music room not just to remember your father, but to share his love of music with others. Teach your students, invite community members, host small concerts if you want to. Music is meant to be shared, Emily. It's meant to bring people together. That's what your father understood, and that's what I hope you'll help others understand too. Emily felt a warmth spreading through her chest as she considered this request. It wasn't really a condition at all. It was an opportunity to turn her personal healing into something that could benefit her entire community. She could picture it already. Children from her school learning to play instruments in a room dedicated to her father's memory, local musicians gathering for informal jam sessions, families discovering the same joy in music that had sustained her and James Parker through so many years. I promise, Emily said, her voice strong and clear for the first time since she had walked through the Strait family's door. I promise to share it, to keep my father's love of music alive by passing it on to others. George stood up and extended his hand to Emily, and when she took it, she felt as though she were accepting not just his generous offer, but a new chapter of her life that she couldn't have imagined just hours earlier. Then it's settled, George said with satisfaction. We'll start making arrangements tomorrow. I have a real estate agent I trust who can help you find the right property, and I know some contractors who do excellent work. We'll make sure everything is done properly, with all the legal paperwork handled by my attorneys, so there are no complications down the road. Emily shook her head in wonder, still struggling to fully accept the reality of what was happening. Mr. Strait, Mrs. Strait, I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this kindness. You don't repay kindness, Norma said with a gentle smile. You pass it forward. You take what you've been given and use it to make someone else's life a little better. That's how kindness grows in the world. As they made their way back toward the main living area, Emily carrying the first armload of albums that George had selected for her, she felt as though she were walking through a dream. The weight of the records in her arms was substantial, but it was nothing compared to the weight of gratitude and possibility that filled her heart. "Emily," George said, as they settled back into the comfortable chairs where their conversation had begun, "I want to ask you about something else. How would you feel about sharing your story publicly? Not for publicity or commercial purposes, but because I think people need to hear about kindness, about gratitude, about the way music can connect strangers and heal broken hearts." Emily considered the question carefully. Privacy had always been important to her, and the idea of public attention was somewhat intimidating. But if sharing her story could inspire others to acts of kindness, or help them find healing through music, then perhaps it was worth the discomfort. "If you think it would help people, then yes," Emily said. "My father always taught me that our experiences, both good and bad, are meant to be lessons for others. If our story can encourage someone else to keep going through a difficult time, or inspire someone to reach out to a neighbor in need, then I'm willing to share it." George nodded approvingly. He had hoped she would be open to the idea, not for any self-serving reasons, but because he genuinely believed their encounter represented something the world needed to see more of: genuine human compassion, transcending the boundaries of fame and social status. "We'll be careful about how we handle it," George assured her. "No exploitation, no sensationalism. Just an honest story about how music brings people together, and how sometimes the most important gestures are the simplest ones." As the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the Texas sky, casting long shadows through the mansion's elegant windows, Emily realized that her life had been fundamentally altered in ways she was still trying to comprehend. She had come to San Antonio to leave flowers at a gate, a small gesture of gratitude that she expected no one would even notice. Instead, she was leaving with signed albums, the promise of a new home, and most importantly, the knowledge that genuine kindness still existed in a world that often seemed harsh and indifferent. But the biggest surprise was yet to come, and as George walked toward his guitar collection with a particular gleam in his eye, Emily sensed that this extraordinary day was about to become even more unforgettable. George stopped in front of a vintage acoustic guitar, mounted in a place of honor on the wall, its worn finish telling the story of countless hours of use. The instrument had obviously been well loved, with gentle wear marks around the sound hole and fret positions that spoke of decades of passionate playing. "Emily, this guitar has been with me since 1975, George said, his voice taking on a reverent tone that made it clear this instrument held special significance. "I wrote some of my biggest hits on this guitar. Amarillo Morning, The Chair, Check Yes or No. They all started with me sitting alone with this old friend, working out melodies and lyrics until they felt right." Emily watched in fascination as George carefully removed the guitar from its mount, handling it with the tenderness of someone greeting an old companion. The instrument seemed to come alive in his hands, and even before he began to play, she could sense the deep connection between artist and tool that had created so much beautiful music over the years. "Your father's favorite song was The Chair," George continued, settling into a comfortable position with the guitar resting naturally across his lap. "I'd like to play it for you now, here in this room, the way it was meant to be heard. Just voice, guitar, and the story the song wants to tell." What happened next transcended every expectation Emily had harbored about meeting her musical hero. George began to play the opening chords of The Chair, and his voice, unamplified and intimate, filled the room with a warmth that no recording could capture. This wasn't a performance in the traditional sense. It was a personal gift, a moment of pure musical connection between artist and audience of one. As George sang about chance encounters and unexpected love, Emily felt her father's presence in the room as strongly as if James Parker were sitting beside her. She could picture him in their old kitchen, humming along to this very song while he prepared dinner after a long day at the auto shop. The melody that had provided the soundtrack to countless father-daughter moments was now being performed live by its creator, in a setting that made the whole experience feel like a beautiful dream. Norma watched the scene unfold with tears in her eyes, recognizing the profound gift her husband was giving this young woman. In 52 years of marriage, she had watched George perform thousands of times, but rarely had she seen him invest such personal emotion into a song. This wasn't about entertaining an audience. This was about honoring a man he had never met through music that had brought meaning to a family's life. When the last notes faded away, the room fell into a silence that felt sacred. Emily sat with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the beauty of what she had just experienced and the generosity of spirit that had made it possible. "Thank you," Emily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "My father would have loved this so much. He always said that music sounded different when it came from the heart, and I've never understood what he meant until right now." George set the guitar aside and looked at Emily with an expression that was both gentle and serious. "Emily, I want you to have this guitar." The words hung in the air like an impossible proposition, and Emily was certain she had misunderstood. The guitar George had just played was clearly one of his most treasured possessions, an instrument with historical significance that belonged in a museum, not in the hands of a small-town teacher. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to have this guitar," George repeated, his tone making it clear this wasn't a casual offer, but a carefully considered decision. "This instrument has given me decades of joy and creative inspiration. Now I want it to continue making music, to help you share your father's love of song with your students and your community." Emily shook her head vigorously, backing away from the guitar as if it might burn her if she touched it. "Mr. Strait, I can't possibly accept that. It's priceless. It's part of music history. I don't even play guitar very well. I mostly stick to piano for my teaching." "Then you'll learn," George said with a smile that brooked no argument. "Music is meant to be played, Emily, not preserved in a case. This guitar wants to make music again, and I can't think of anyone who would honor its legacy better than someone who understands how much music can mean to a family." Norma stepped forward and placed her hands on Emily's shoulders, her touch both comforting and grounding. "Emily, my husband doesn't make offers like this lightly. That guitar has been his companion through some of the most important moments of his career. If he wants you to have it, it's because he sees something in you that makes him believe you'll use it to create something beautiful." Emily looked back and forth between George and Norma, searching their faces for any sign that this was some kind of elaborate joke or misunderstanding, but all she saw was genuine sincerity and a quiet joy that suggested they were as moved by this gesture as she was overwhelmed by it. "I promise I'll learn to play it properly," Emily said finally, her voice trembling with the weight of accepting such an extraordinary gift. "I promise I'll use it to teach my students and to keep my father's memory alive through music." "That's all I could ask for," George replied, carefully placing the guitar in Emily's hands. The instrument felt substantial but comfortable, and as her fingers found the strings, she was amazed to discover that it seemed to welcome her touch. Over the next hour, George and Norma shared stories about their own experiences with loss and healing, about the role music had played in helping them navigate the most difficult periods of their lives. They talked about their daughter Jennifer, about how creating music had been one of the few things that helped them process their grief after her death. They spoke about the responsibility that comes with success, about the importance of using whatever platform life gives you to make the world a little bit kinder. "Emily," Norma said as the afternoon light began to fade, "I want you to know that meeting you today has been a gift to us as well. Your gratitude, your love for your father, your dedication to teaching, you've reminded us why we fell in love with music in the first place. It's not about fame or awards or commercial success. It's about connection, about the way a song can bridge the gap between strangers and make us all feel less alone in the world." As the time came for Emily to leave, the reality of everything that had transpired began to settle over her like a warm blanket. She was leaving with signed albums, the promise of a new home and a guitar that had created some of country music's most beloved songs. But more than the material gifts, she was leaving with a renewed faith in human kindness and a sense of purpose that extended far beyond her own healing. George and Norma walked Emily to the front door, where Marcus waited to escort her back to her car. The albums had been carefully packed in protective cases, and the guitar rode in a custom gig bag that George insisted she take along with the instrument. "We'll be in touch very soon about the house," George promised. "My real estate agent will call you tomorrow, and we'll make sure everything moves forward quickly. You shouldn't have to spend another night in that motel room unless you choose to. And Emily," Norma added, "please stay in touch with us. We want to hear about your students, about the music room when it's finished, about all the wonderful things that are going to come from this new chapter of your life." As Emily drove away from the Strait mansion, her car loaded with treasures beyond her wildest dreams, she felt as though she were leaving one life behind and driving toward another. The grief over losing her father and her home hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed into something more manageable, something that could coexist with hope and gratitude and excitement about the future. 6 months later, Emily stood in the music room of her new house watching as a group of her students gathered around her for their weekly after-school music club. The room was everything George and Norma had promised it would be: spacious, acoustically perfect, and filled with instruments that the Straits had continued to donate over the weeks following their first meeting. A framed photograph of James Parker in his army uniform held a place of honor on the wall, surrounded by the signed albums that had started this incredible journey. "Mrs. Parker, will you play The Chair again?" asked 10-year-old Sarah Martinez, whose own father worked long hours at the local factory and rarely had time for music. Emily picked up the vintage guitar that had once belonged to George Strait, her fingers now confident on the frets after months of dedicated practice. As she began to play the opening chords, she thought about her father, about George and Norma, about the mysterious ways that kindness could multiply and spread from person to person, like ripples on a pond. The story of Emily's encounter with the Strait family had indeed become public, shared first through a carefully crafted interview with a local television station and then picked up by national media outlets hungry for positive news in a world often dominated by conflict and division. The response had been overwhelming, with people from across the country sending letters and donations to support Emily's music education efforts. But perhaps the most meaningful response had come from other teachers, other single parents, other people who had faced devastating losses and found inspiration in Emily's journey from despair to hope. The music room had become a gathering place not just for students, but for community members who wanted to experience the healing power of song in the same way that James Parker and his daughter had discovered it years earlier. As Emily finished playing The Chair and watched her students' faces light up with the joy that only music can create, she knew that her father's love for country music had come full circle. The albums that had been lost in the fire had been replaced by something even more valuable, a living legacy of musical education and community connection that would touch countless lives for years to come. That evening, after the students had gone home and the music room had fallen quiet, Emily received a phone call from Norma Strait. "Emily, dear, how are things going with the music program?" Norma asked, her voice warm with genuine interest. "Better than I ever imagined," Emily replied, settling into the comfortable chair beside her father's photograph. "We have 23 students in the program now, and 3 of them are learning to play guitar on instruments you and George donated. Sarah Martinez, you remember I told you about her father who works at the factory. She's showing real talent. I think she might want to pursue music seriously someday." "That's wonderful news," Norma said. "George will be so pleased to hear it. You know, Emily, we've been thinking about visiting your town sometime soon. George has a break in his touring schedule next month, and we'd love to see what you've built there." Emily's heart leaped at the possibility of seeing her benefactors again, of showing them firsthand how their generosity had blossomed into something that was enriching her entire community. "You would be welcome any time," Emily said. "The children would be so excited to meet you both, and I know the whole town would turn out to thank you for what you've done." As Emily hung up the phone and prepared for bed in the house that kindness had built, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the depths of despair to this moment of contentment and purpose. The fire that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something far more beautiful than she could have imagined. Her father's collection of albums had been destroyed, but his love for music lived on in ways that multiplied its impact beyond anything James Parker could have dreamed. Emily smiled as she turned off the lights in the music room, knowing that tomorrow would bring new students, new songs, and new opportunities to pass forward the gift of kindness that had transformed her life. The story of Emily Parker and George Strait had become more than a tale of celebrity generosity. It had become a testament to the power of human connection, the healing nature of music, and the way that simple acts of gratitude can set in motion chains of kindness that echo through generations. In a world that often seemed divided and harsh, their encounter proved that compassion still existed, that strangers could become family, and that sometimes the most beautiful music comes not from concert stages, but from the quiet moments when people choose to care for one another.